The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Aztec, New Mexico territory, as Katherine Sullivan struggled to balance her heavy basket against her swollen belly. At 6 months pregnant, every step was becoming more difficult, especially in the oppressive July heat of 1878. The stares from the townsfolk followed her like unwelcome shadows, their whispers cutting through the air as sharp as knives. It had been only 3 months since her husband Michael's death, and already the town had sentenced her to a life of ridicule and isolation. Katherine brushed a strand of honey-brown hair from her perspiring forehead and tried to ignore the murmurs that grew louder as she approached the general store. Her worn boots kicked up dust as she walked, her navy blue calico dress one of the few that still accommodated her growing belly hanging limply in the heat. The wedding band on her finger caught the sunlight, a painful reminder of the life she'd lost when that mining accident took Michael away forever. As she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk of Prescott's general store, she took a deep breath, bracing herself for what awaited inside. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, announcing her presence to the handful of customers already perusing the shelves. The conversation immediately hushed, then resumed in conspiratorial tones. "Afternoon, Mrs. Sullivan," Mr. Prescott said from behind the counter, his greeting cordial but his eyes cold. At 56, Arthur Prescott had run the store for nearly 2 decades, and while he'd never outright refused her business, his disapproval was evident in every interaction. "Afternoon," Katherine replied softly, keeping her eyes downcast as she moved toward the dry goods. She needed flour, sugar, coffee, and a few other essentials that would hopefully last through the week. Her meager savings were dwindling rapidly, and she'd soon need to find work, though who would hire a pregnant widow was beyond her comprehension. As she reached for a small sack of flour, she heard a woman's voice purposely pitched to Carrie. "Shameful, isn't it? Her husband barely cold in his grave, and her parading around in that condition." Katherine's hand froze mid-air, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The speaker was Harriet Jenkins, wife of the bank manager and self-appointed moral authority of Aztec. "I heard," another voice joined in, belonging to Mabel Winthrop, "that she was like this before poor Michael even passed. No wonder he was working double shifts in that dangerous mine, probably trying to escape." Katherine's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. The cruel words stung all the more for their injustice. She and Michael had been overjoyed about the baby. He'd kissed her belly every morning before heading to the mines, promising to build a nursery when he returned. But he never did return, crushed under tons of rock when the support beams gave way. Determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break, Katherine carefully selected her items, calculating the cost in her head as she went. When she reached for a jar of molasses on a high shelf, a sharp pain shot through her lower back, causing her to gasp and drop the basket. The contents spilled across the floor, the noise drawing every eye in the store. "Well," Harriet said loudly enough for all to hear, "some people clearly can't manage the simplest tasks. Perhaps you should have thought about that before your situation, Mrs. Sullivan." Katherine knelt awkwardly, trying to gather her scattered items, fighting back tears of pain and humiliation. It was then that a shadow fell across her, and a deep voice cut through the murmurs. "Allow me, madam." Katherine looked up to find herself staring into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his faded blue shirt. A stranger, wearing trail-worn clothes and a Stetson pushed back on his head, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in its rugged contours. "Thank you," she whispered as he efficiently collected her items, placing them back in the basket. Without acknowledging the staring onlookers, he helped Katherine to her feet with a gentle hand. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes' laugh lines and a small scar that bisected his left eyebrow. "Xavier Flanagan," he said quietly, tipping his hat. Just passing through, seems you could use an extra pair of hands." Before she could respond, Harriet Jenkins stepped forward, her pinched face contorted in a look of false concern. "Mr. Flanagan, is it? I wouldn't trouble yourself with Mrs. Sullivan. She's quite capable of managing her own indiscretions." Xavier's expression didn't change, but Katherine noticed how his shoulders straightened, adding another inch to his already imposing height. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. "Madam, where I come from, offering assistance to a lady isn't trouble, it's common decency." His eyes swept the store, taking in the judgmental faces. Something seemingly in short supply around here. A hush fell over the store. Harriet's face flushed crimson, but for once she seemed at a loss for words. Xavier turned his attention back to Katherine, his expression softening. "Now, Mrs. Sullivan, is there anything else you need before we settle up?" Katherine blinked, surprised by his intervention. I still need a few things, but I can manage." "I'm sure you can," he said with a nod. "But 4 hands work better than 2, especially when one set belongs to someone tall enough to reach those top shelves without stretching." His small smile was kind, with no trace of pity or judgment, and Katherine found herself nodding in acceptance of his offer. As they moved through the store together, she became aware of whispers resuming, but Xavier seemed untroubled by them. He reached for items she pointed out, occasionally offering suggestions of his own. "The jerky's fresh," he noted. "Good protein for both of you." Katherine hesitated, looking at the price, but he simply added it to her basket. When they reached the counter, Mr. Prescott tallied up the items with deliberate slowness. "That'll be $2.16, he announced, his tone suggesting the amount was questionable for someone in Katherine's circumstances. As she reached for her small coin purse, Xavier placed his hand gently on her arm. "Allow me," he said, pulling out a leather wallet and counting out the exact amount. "I can't accept," Katherine began. "Consider it a neighbor's courtesy," he interrupted smoothly. "Even if I'm just passing through." Mr. Prescott reluctantly accepted the money, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. As Xavier gathered the parcels, Katherine noticed Harriet and her companions huddled by the fabric table, their heads close together in conspiracy. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her as heavily as the New Mexico sun. Outside, the heat hit them like a physical force after the relative coolness of the store. Xavier adjusted his hat, shielding his eyes from the glare. "Which way are you headed, Mrs. Sullivan?" Katherine pointed down the dusty street. "I live at the edge of town, just past the blacksmith's." "Then I'll walk with you," he said, as if it were already decided. "These parcels are heavier than they look." "You don't have to do that," Katherine said, though the relief in her voice betrayed her true feelings. "You've already been kind enough." Xavier's smile was genuine. "Madam, I've been riding for 3 days straight with nothing but my horse for conversation. The pleasure of your company would be payment enough." As they walked down the main street of Aztec, Katherine was acutely aware of the curious eyes following their progress. Xavier, however, seemed completely at ease, adjusting his pace to match her slower steps, and occasionally pointing out something of interest: a new hitching post outside the sheriff's office, a family of quail scurrying across the road. "How long have you lived in Aztec?" he asked as they passed the blacksmith shop, where the rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil punctuated the afternoon. "Nearly 2 years, Katherine replied. "Michael, my husband, he came for the mining work. We were from Colorado originally, but the company was offering good wages here." Xavier nodded, his expression sobering. "I heard about the accident at the Sullivan mine, lost some good men from what folks say." 12, Katherine confirmed, her voice tight. "Michael was the foreman." He'd been concerned about the support beams for weeks, kept telling the owners they needed reinforcement. She swallowed hard. They didn't listen. "Often the way with mining companies," Xavier said grimly. "Profit over people until disaster strikes, then it's all prayers and condolences while they count what's left in the coffers." They walked in silence for a moment until Katherine asked, "What brings you to Aztec, Mr. Flanagan?" "Call me Xavier, please," he said, shifting the heavy parcels in his arms. "I've been working cattle drives up from Texas, but the last outfit I was with disbanded after reaching Santa Fe. I heard there might be work at the Broken Spur Ranch outside of town." "That's Mr. Hemingway's place," Katherine said. "I've heard he's hiring, expanding his operation since his son came back from back east." They rounded a corner, and Katherine's small house came into view. It was a modest structure, one of several built by the mining company for its workers, with a small porch and a struggling vegetable garden to one side. The paint was peeling, and one of the shutters hung at an awkward angle, but it was clean and well kept. "It's not much," Katherine said, suddenly self-conscious as she led the way up the path. "But it's home, at least for now." "Looks like a fine place," Xavier replied, following her onto the porch. "Solid construction, good location, gets the morning sun but shade in the afternoon heat." Katherine fumbled with her key, acutely aware of him standing behind her, tall and substantial. When the door swung open, she stepped aside to let him enter with the parcels. The interior was small but neat, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A doorway to the right led to a single bedroom, and a ladder indicated a small loft space above. Xavier set the parcels on the kitchen table, taking in the modest furnishings. The worn but clean curtains, the small shelf of books, the carefully mended quilt draped over a rocking chair. "Thank you for your help," Katherine said, standing awkwardly by the door, "and for what you did at the store." Xavier removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his temples. "Those women had no right to speak to you that way," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Grief is hard enough without adding the burden of others' judgment." Katherine blinked rapidly, fighting sudden tears. It had been so long since anyone had shown her simple kindness that she hardly knew how to respond. "Would you like some coffee?" "It's the least I can offer after you paid for my groceries." Xavier's smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines left by years under the western sun. "I'd be obliged, madam, if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Katherine assured him, moving to the stove where a kettle sat. As she prepared the coffee, she was conscious of him taking a seat at the small table, his large frame making the room seem even smaller. "You mentioned you're from Colorado," Xavier said, breaking the silence. "Whereabouts?" "A small town called Silverton," Katherine replied, measuring coffee into the pot. "My father was a schoolteacher there." "Beautiful country," Xavier nodded. "I drove cattle through there once, back in '73, mountains so high they seemed to scrape the sky." "Yes," Katherine said softly, a wave of homesickness washing over her. "I miss the mountains sometimes, the air there so clean and sharp it makes your lungs ache." She poured the boiling water over the coffee grounds, allowing the rich aroma to fill the small kitchen. "What about you? Where do you call home?" Xavier's expression grew distant. "Been on the move most of my life. Born in Texas near San Antonio but left when I was 16. Worked ranches from Montana to New Mexico, drove cattle up the Kishom Trail more times than I care to count." He shrugged, a small smile touching his lips. "Home's wherever my horse and I decide to stop for a while." Katherine set a steaming cup before him, then eased herself into the chair opposite, one hand unconsciously going to her lower back where a dull ache had settled. "The baby giving you trouble?" Xavier asked, his gaze perceptive. Katherine was startled by his directness but found it refreshing after months of sideways glances and whispered comments. "Just the usual discomforts," she admitted. "The doctor says everything's progressing normally." Xavier nodded, sipping his coffee. "My sister has 5 children," he offered. "Says each one made their presence known in different ways. The last one, my nephew Samuel, apparently spent most of his time using her ribs as a drum." Katherine laughed, the sound surprising her. How long had it been since she'd laughed? "This little one seems to prefer dancing, especially at night when I'm trying to sleep." A comfortable silence fell between them as they drank their coffee. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. From somewhere down the street came the sound of children playing, their high voices carrying in the still air. "What will you do?" Xavier asked finally, his blue eyes serious as they met hers. "After the baby comes, I mean." The question was one Katherine had asked herself countless times over the sleepless nights since Michael's death. "I don't know," she admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "The mining company provided this house as part of Michael's compensation, but they've made it clear I can't stay indefinitely. There's a small pension, but it won't be enough." She sighed. "I can sew, and I did some teaching back in Colorado. Perhaps there might be work along those lines." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "Good skills to have, especially out here where both are in short supply." He hesitated, then added, "Those women in the store, they don't speak for everyone in town. There must be some who'd be willing to help." Katherine's smile was sad. "You'd think so, wouldn't you?" "But grief makes people uncomfortable, Mr. Flanagan, and a pregnant widow. Well, that's doubly troubling, easier to judge than to extend a hand." "Xavier," he reminded her gently, "and those who find it easier to judge than to help aren't worth troubling yourself over." Katherine found herself studying his face, the earnestness in his expression. There was something solid about Xavier Flanagan, something trustworthy in those blue eyes that had seen much of the world yet remained kind. "You're very different from most men I've met out here," she said without thinking. He raised an eyebrow. "Different how? Most would have walked right past me in that store," Katherine said honestly. "Or worse, joined in the mockery. Trail hands and cowboys especially aren't known for getting involved in a woman's troubles." Xavier's expression turned thoughtful. "My mother raised her children to believe that character isn't measured by how you treat those who can help you, but by how you treat those who can't." He shrugged as if embarrassed by his own words. Simple as that. The clock on the wall chimed 4, startling them both. Xavier drained his cup and stood, reaching for his hat. "I should be moving on. Need to see about that job at the Broken Spur before nightfall." Katherine rose as well, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Of course, and thank you again for everything." At the door, Xavier turned, hesitating as if wanting to say more. Finally, he simply nodded. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Sullivan, and the little one." "Katherine," she said impulsively. "Please call me Katherine." His smile was worth the small breach of propriety. "Katherine, then. Good day to you." As she watched him walk down the path, his tall figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, Katherine had the strangest feeling that their paths would cross again. It was an irrational thought, born perhaps of loneliness or the simple human need for connection, but it lingered nonetheless as she closed the door and turned back to the quiet of her empty home. The next morning dawned with the promise of another scorching day. Katherine woke early, her back aching and her mind filled with the strange dreams that had plagued her sleep, dreams of dark mine shafts and Michael's voice calling out, dreams of blue eyes and strong hands steadying her when she stumbled. She rose and dressed, moving through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. There was bread to bake, mending to finish for Mrs. Cooper down the street, one of the few in town who still employed her services, and a letter to write to her father, carefully worded to conceal the worst of her circumstances. By mid-morning, the heat had become oppressive, turning the small house into an oven despite the windows thrown open to catch any stray breeze. Katherine sat at the table, needle flashing in the sunlight as she repaired a tear in one of Mrs. Cooper's dresses, when a knock at the door startled her. Visitors were rare enough that she felt a flutter of apprehension as she set aside her sewing and moved to answer. When she opened the door, she was shocked to find Xavier Flanagan standing on her porch, hat in hand, his expression both determined and slightly uncertain. "Mr. Flanagan," she exclaimed, "I didn't expect to see you again." "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, shifting his weight. "I was in town for supplies and thought I'd check how you were faring." Catherine was suddenly conscious of her simple dress, her hair hastily pinned up to keep it off her neck in the heat. "I'm well, thank you. Would you like to come in? It's not much cooler inside, I'm afraid, but at least there's shade." He nodded, stepping into the house with that same careful courtesy he'd shown the day before. Catherine noticed he wore clean clothes today, though still work-worn, a faded blue shirt, denim trousers, and boots that had seen many miles. "Did you secure the position at the Broken Spur?" she asked, moving to pour him a glass of water from the pitcher she kept on the counter. "I did," he confirmed, accepting the water gratefully. "Mr. Hemingway was looking for experienced hands to help with the new stock he's bringing in. Pays fair wages, too." "That's wonderful news," Catherine said, genuinely pleased for him. "The Broken Spur has a good reputation. Mr. Hemingway is strict but fair from what I've heard." Xavier drank deeply, then set the glass down. "That seems accurate. He's particular about how things are done, but he provides decent lodging and 3 square meals, which is more than some outfits offer." A silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable but laden with unasked questions. Catherine found herself studying his face in the morning light, noting the way the sun through the window caught the hints of auburn in his dark hair, the fine lines that fanned out from his eyes when he smiled. "I brought you something," Xavier said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much, but I thought it might be useful." Surprised, Catherine took the package, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. She unwrapped it carefully to find a small jar of ointment. The label, handwritten in a neat script, read lavender and chamomile balm. "For the backaches," Xavier explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "My sister swore by it when she was expecting. The apothecary in town makes it fresh." Catherine stared at the jar, then up at him, deeply touched by the thoughtful gesture. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind." Xavier shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing. Just remembered how you were rubbing your back yesterday." He cleared his throat, changing the subject. "I've also been asking around town about work opportunities. There's a new family moved in at the North End, name of Taylor. They have 4 young children and were wondering about arranging some schooling." Catherine's heart quickened. "Teaching." "They're looking for a teacher. They mentioned wanting someone who could give lessons a few times a week." Xavier nodded. "Nothing formal like a proper school, but they're willing to pay. I took the liberty of mentioning that you had experience in that line of work. You did that for me." Catherine asked, astonished. "But why?" Xavier met her gaze steadily. "Because everyone deserves a fair chance, Catherine, and because I think you'd be good at it." Before she could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and clutch at the edge of the table. Xavier was at her side instantly, his hand steady on her elbow. "Are you all right? Is it the baby?" Catherine breathed deeply, waiting for the pain to subside. "Just a twinge," she assured him, though her face remained pale. "The doctor says it's normal at this stage." "The baby's growing, shifting position." Xavier didn't look convinced, his blue eyes clouded with concern. "Maybe you should sit down," he suggested, guiding her to the rocking chair. "Can I get you anything? More water?" "No, I'm fine, truly," Catherine insisted, though she didn't resist his help. As she settled into the chair, she noticed him glancing around the small room, taking note of the mending piled on the table, the bread dough rising on the counter, the single pair of worn boots by the door. His gaze was assessing but not judgmental, and she felt a sudden urge to explain herself. "It's not always like this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the sparse surroundings. "When Michael was alive, things were different. He had plans, we had plans. A bigger house eventually, maybe a small business of our own someday." Xavier's expression softened as he pulled a chair over to sit across from her. "Dreams are important," he said simply. "They keep us moving forward when the present gets hard." "What about you?" Catherine asked, curious. "What dreams drive Xavier Flanagan across the Western Territories?" He smiled, a hint of self-deprecation in the curve of his lips. "Nothing so grand as you might think. A piece of land someday, perhaps. Somewhere with good water and enough grass to run a modest herd. A place to put down roots after years of drifting. That sounds like a fine dream, Katherine said, finding herself drawn to the quiet sincerity in his voice. A home of your own. Never seemed possible before, Xavier admitted, his gaze drifting to the window where the distant mountains shimmered in the heat. Cowboy wages don't add up to much, and good land is getting scarcer every year. But lately, I've been thinking it might be time to try. They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing easily between them. Katherine learned that Xavier had lost his parents young his father to a Comanche raid when he was 10, his mother to influenza 3 years later. He'd been raised by an older sister and her husband on a small ranch near San Antonio, leaving at 16 to make his own way. Wasn't running from anything, he explained. Just felt the need to see what else the world held. In return, Katherine told him about growing up in Colorado, the daughter of a schoolteacher who believed education was the key to a better future. About meeting Michael when he came to survey for a new mining operation, the whirlwind courtship that scandalized her father but felt utterly right to her 20-year-old heart. We had 2 good years, she said softly, her hand resting on her rounded belly. Not enough, but they were good. As the sun climbed higher, signaling midday, Xavier finally stood to take his leave. I should let you rest, he said, reaching for his hat. But if you're amenable, I'd like to introduce you to the Taylors tomorrow. They seemed eager to arrange something soon for their children. Katherine felt a surge of hope at the prospect of meaningful work. I'd like that very much. At the door, Xavier hesitated, his expression suddenly uncertain. Katherine, I hope I haven't overstepped. I know we've only just met, and you have every reason to be cautious about strangers offering help. Katherine looked up at him. This man who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she'd experienced in the 3 months since Michael's death. Some people, she said carefully, you feel you've known longer than you have. I can't explain it, but I trust you, Xavier Flanagan, strange as that may sound. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Not strange at all, he said quietly. Not to me. After he left, Katherine sat for a long time in the rocking chair, one hand absently stroking her belly as the baby shifted and kicked within. For the first time in months, she felt something that had been missing since the day the mine manager had appeared at her door with his hat in his hands and sorrow in his eyes. Hope. Small and fragile, but unmistakably there. The following day, Xavier arrived promptly at 10, as promised. Katherine had taken special care with her appearance, choosing her best maternity dress, a dark green cotton that Michael had always said brought out the gold in her hazel eyes, and arranging her hair in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. The Taylors lived on the northern outskirts of Aztec, and Xavier had arranged to borrow a wagon from the Broken Spur for the journey. Mr. Hemingway was surprisingly accommodating when I explained the purpose, Xavier told her as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. Seems he has strong opinions about the importance of education for the territory's children. The ride to the Taylor homestead took nearly 40 minutes, giving Katherine time to appreciate the beauty of the landscape despite the heat. The San Juan River glinted in the distance, a ribbon of silver winding through the arid terrain. Cottonwoods and willows marked its course, their green a stark contrast to the red and ochre of the surrounding mesas. Xavier was a comfortable companion, neither filling the silence with needless chatter nor withdrawing into himself. He pointed out landmarks as they passed a rock formation that resembled a sleeping giant, the distant smudge on the horizon that marked a Navajo settlement, a hawk circling lazily above a field where rabbits might be found. You know this country well for someone just passing through, Katherine observed. Xavier nodded, handling the reins with practiced ease as he guided the horses around a rut in the road. I worked a ranch about 20 miles north of here some years back. Different owner then, but the land doesn't change much. Not in the ways that matter. The Taylor homestead came into view as they crested a small rise, a substantial adobe structure with several outbuildings, and a corral where horses grazed in the shade of a large cottonwood. Fields of corn and beans stretched behind the house, irrigated by a clever system of ditches that diverted water from a nearby creek. "They've done well for themselves," Katherine murmured, impressed by the orderly prosperity of the place. "The Taylors came from Ohio with some capital," Xavier explained. "Mr. Taylor was a banker there, decided to try his hand at farming in the territories, seems to have a knack for it." As the wagon pulled up to the house, the front door opened to reveal a tall, robust man with sandy hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Behind him clustered a woman and 4 children of varying ages, their faces curious but welcoming. "Mr. Flanagan." The man called, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "Right on time as promised, and this must be Mrs. Sullivan." Xavier jumped down from the wagon and moved around to help Katherine descend. "Mr. Taylor, Mrs. Taylor," he greeted them. "Allow me to introduce Katherine Sullivan." The introductions continued as the Taylor children Robert, age 11, twins Eliza and Emma, age 9, and Thomas, age 6 were presented. Mrs. Taylor, a plump, cheerful woman named Margaret, immediately took Katherine's arm and guided her into the house, clucking sympathetically about the heat and Katherine's condition. "You must be parched, you poor dear. Come in, come in. I've lemonade cooling in the well, and we can talk comfortably inside while the men discuss whatever it is men discuss when they think we're not listening." Katherine found herself ensconced in a comfortable chair in the Taylors' spacious parlor, a glass of cool lemonade in her hand, and the children arranged on chairs and stools around her, their eyes bright with curiosity. "Mr. Flanagan tells us you were a teacher back in Colorado," Margaret said, settling herself on a nearby settee. "We've been so concerned about the children's education since moving here. The nearest proper school is in Farmington, much too far for daily travel." "I assisted my father, who was the schoolmaster in Silverton," Katherine explained. "I taught the younger children while he handled the older students and more advanced subjects." "Perfect," Margaret exclaimed. "That's exactly what we need. Robert has a good foundation already, but the girls and Thomas are at critical stages. We were thinking perhaps 3 mornings a week to start. Would that be too strenuous in your condition?" Katherine felt a surge of gratitude toward Xavier for arranging this opportunity. "Not at all," she assured Margaret. "I find keeping busy helps, actually, and I've always enjoyed teaching." As they discussed arrangements, subjects to be covered, books needed, compensation, Katherine became aware of Xavier and Mr. Taylor passing by the window, deep in conversation as they toured the property. She caught a glimpse of Xavier's profile, intent and thoughtful as he listened to something Taylor was explaining, and felt an unexpected warmth in her chest. By the time they departed in the late afternoon, Katherine had secured a position teaching the Taylor children 3 mornings a week, with the possibility of adding more hours after the baby arrived if all went well. The salary, while modest, would supplement her dwindling savings and provide much-needed security for the months ahead. "You've changed everything," Katherine said quietly to Xavier as they drove back toward town, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. "I don't know how to thank you." Xavier kept his eyes on the road, but she saw the pleased smile that curved his lips. "You earned that position on your own merits, Katherine. I just made the introduction." "Nevertheless," she insisted, "you've shown me more kindness in 3 days than I've known since Michael died. I won't forget it." Xavier was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. Finally, he said, "I lost someone once, not a spouse, but someone I cared for deeply. I know what it's like to carry that grief while the world expects you to simply move on." Katherine studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw now tightened with some remembered pain. "What happened?" she asked gently. He sighed, adjusting his grip on the reins. "Her name was Alina. We met in Santa Fe when I was driving cattle north from Texas. She worked at a hotel there, saving money to open a millinery shop someday. His smile was sad, tinged with nostalgia. She had the most beautiful hands, always sketching designs for hats and bonnets. We were planning to marry when I returned from that season's drive. Katherine waited, sensing there was more to the story, not wanting to push but offering silent support with her presence. There was an outbreak of cholera while I was gone, Xavier continued, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of old pain. By the time I returned, she'd been gone for nearly a month. No one had known how to reach me on the trail. "I'm so sorry," Katherine whispered, understanding now the depth of compassion that had prompted him to help her, a stranger in similar straits. Xavier nodded in acknowledgement, then gave her a sidelong glance. "After a leaner, I threw myself into work, moved from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. It seemed easier that way." He paused. "But that's no way to live, Katherine, not in the long run." As they entered the outskirts of Aztec, the setting sun painted the adobe buildings in shades of gold and amber. Katherine was struck by the unexpected beauty of it. This town that had felt so hostile for months now transformed by the simple shift in her fortunes, and perhaps by the man beside her whose quiet strength had begun to ease the weight of her solitude. "Will you come in for supper?" she asked impulsively as they reached her house. "It's nothing fancy, just a stew I set to simmer this morning, but there's plenty." Xavier's smile was answer enough, though he added, "I'd be honored if you're sure it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Katherine assured him, suddenly looking forward to the evening in a way she hadn't anticipated any evening in a very long time. That night, as they sat across from each other at her small table, sharing a simple meal and conversation that flowed as naturally as the river through the valley, Katherine found herself studying Xavier's hands, strong, capable hands that had helped her when she fell, that had reached for items on high shelves, that now broke bread with the same care and attention he seemed to bring to everything. And for the first time since the mine collapse had shattered her world, Katherine Sullivan felt the fragile beginnings of something new taking root in the soil of her grief, something unexpected and tentative, but alive with possibility. Over the next 3 weeks, a pattern emerged that gradually became the framework of Katherine's days. 3 mornings a week, Xavier would arrive with the wagon from Broken Spur to transport her to the Taylor homestead, where she would spend several hours teaching the children while Mrs. Taylor tended to household matters. On the return journey, they often stopped at the small creek that ran parallel to the road, resting in the shade of the cottonwoods while Xavier shared stories of his travels, and Katherine spoke of her hopes for the baby and her tentative plans for the future. On the days she didn't teach, Xavier would still appear, sometimes bringing small gifts, a jar of honey from a beekeeper outside town, a bundle of fresh carrots from the Broken Spur garden, once even a small wooden horse he'd carved himself during evening hours at the bunkhouse. "For the baby," he'd said gruffly, clearly embarrassed by her emotional response to the simple toy. "Every child should have something to dream with." In the evenings, he would often join her for supper, insisting on contributing to the meal either by bringing additional food or by handling tasks that had become difficult in her advancing pregnancy, chopping wood for the stove, fetching water from the well, fixing the loose shutter that had banged in every strong wind since Michael's death. It was during one such evening, as they sat on her small porch watching the sun sink behind the distant mesas, that Xavier broached a subject that had been hovering unspoken between them. "The foreman at Broken Spur mentioned that the mining company is looking to sell these houses," he said carefully, his eyes on the horizon rather than her face. "Now that the mine's closed, they want to divest themselves of properties in town." Katherine's hands stilled in her lap. "Yes, I received a letter last week. They've given me until the end of the month to either purchase or vacate." Xavier turned to her then, his expression troubled. "Do you have options? Family you could stay with?" My father is elderly, living with my brother's family in Denver now, Katherine said, trying to keep her voice steady. I've written to them, but… She trailed off, not wanting to admit the painful truth that her family's response had been lukewarm at best. They had room for her, they'd written, but it would be a temporary arrangement until she could find suitable employment in Denver, difficult enough for a woman alone, nearly impossible for one with a newborn. Xavier was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant barking of dogs and the soft creak of Katherine's rocking chair. Finally, he said, I've been thinking about something, Katherine. A proposition of sorts, though I know it may seem sudden or inappropriate. Katherine's heart quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. What sort of proposition? Xavier shifted in his chair, uncharacteristically nervous. I've been saving for years, he began, never had much reason to spend what I earned beyond necessities. Mr. Hemingway mentioned that he's willing to sell a portion of his property, good land with water rights, enough for a small ranch operation. He'll even sell me some of his stock to get started. Katherine nodded, not yet seeing how this connected to her situation, but pleased for him nonetheless. That's wonderful, Xavier, your dream of land of your own. Yes, he agreed, but a ranch needs a home and a home. He hesitated, then plunged ahead. A home needs a family to make it complete. Katherine's breath caught as the implication of his words sank in. Xavier, I'm not proposing marriage, not exactly, he hastened to clarify, turning fully to face her now. That would be presumptuous, given how short a time we've known each other. But I am proposing a partnership, Katherine, an arrangement of mutual benefit and respect. What sort of arrangement? Katherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier leaned forward, his blue eyes intent in the fading light. I need someone to help establish a home, to manage the domestic side of a ranch while I handle the stock and land. You need security for yourself and your child, a place to belong. He paused. I'm suggesting that we combine our resources. I'll purchase land and stock. You'll contribute your skills in making a home and eventually, perhaps, teaching the children of neighboring ranches as well. As partners, Katherine said slowly, trying to comprehend what he was offering. Yes, as partners, Xavier confirmed. With separate sleeping quarters, of course, and no obligations of that nature, but sharing the work, the responsibility, and the rewards of building something lasting. And if I were to marry again someday? Katherine asked, needing to understand the parameters of what he proposed. Or if you were to find someone you wished to court? Xavier's expression was thoughtful. Then we would renegotiate our arrangement. I would ensure you and your child remained secure, perhaps with a portion of the property deeded to you outright. Katherine studied his face in the deepening twilight. This man who had entered her life so unexpectedly yet had already become essential to her daily existence. There was no denying the growing attraction between them, the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, the lingering glances they exchanged over simple meals. But there was also no denying the practical wisdom of what he suggested, a solution that would protect her independence while providing the security she desperately needed. This is not how I imagined my life would unfold, she admitted softly. Xavier's smile was gentle. Few of us end up where we expected, Katherine. The question is whether we can find happiness in the unexpected turns. Before she could respond, a sharp pain seized her, more intense than any she had experienced before. Katherine gasped, clutching at her abdomen as the world seemed to tilt around her. Katherine? Xavier was on his feet instantly, kneeling beside her chair. What is it? The baby? Something's wrong, she managed through gritted teeth. It's too early, the baby isn't due for another month. Xavier's face paled, but his voice remained steady. Can you stand? We need to get you to the doctor. Katherine tried to rise but was struck by another wave of pain that sent her staggering against him. Without hesitation, Xavier swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he strode toward the door. The key, Katherine gasped. In my pocket. Xavier somehow managed to retrieve the key and lock the door behind them while still supporting her weight. Then he was moving down the path toward the road, his long strides eating up the distance as Katherine clung to him, trying to breathe through the waves of pain that seemed to be coming faster now. "Hold on," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "I've got you, just hold on." The town's doctor, Abraham Wilson, lived on the main street above his practice. When Xavier pounded on his door, nearly kicking it in with the force of his urgency, the elderly physician appeared in his nightshirt, looking irritated until he saw Katherine's pale face and the spreading dampness of her skirts. "Bring her in," he ordered, professional demeanor instantly replacing his annoyance. "Quickly now. The examination room is through there." Everything that followed seemed to happen in a blur for Katherine. There was the doctor's gentle but firm hands examining her, his grave expression as he confirmed that her labor had begun prematurely. There was Xavier's face, white with concern but steady as he held her hand when the pains intensified. There was the doctor's wife, summoned from upstairs, who efficiently prepared the room and whispered encouragement as Katherine's body was seized by forces beyond her control. "The baby is coming," Dr. Wilson announced after what seemed like hours. "But it's in distress. We need to act quickly." Xavier made to leave the room, offering privacy, but Katherine clutched his hand with desperate strength. "Stay," she pleaded. "Please, I can't do this alone." He hesitated only a moment before nodding, his blue eyes never leaving hers as he positioned himself at the head of the examining table, still holding her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world. What followed was the most grueling experience of Katherine's life. The pain was beyond anything she could have imagined, tearing through her body in relentless waves. But through it all, Xavier remained, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her agony. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Katherine Sullivan," he told her as she struggled. "Your child is lucky to have you for a mother, just a little longer now. You can do this." When the baby finally slipped into the world, the room was silent for one terrifying moment before a thin, reedy cry broke the tension. "Doctor." Wilson's face relaxed into a smile as he held up a tiny, red-faced infant. "A son," he announced. "Small but strong. You have a fine boy, Mrs. Sullivan." Tears streamed down Katherine's face as the doctor's wife cleaned the baby and placed him in her arms. He was indeed small, with a shock of dark hair like Michael's and tiny fists that waved feebly in the air as he adjusted to his sudden entrance into the world. "Hello, little one," Katherine whispered, running a finger along his perfect cheek. "You're early, but oh, how we've been waiting for you." She looked up to find Xavier watching them, his expression a complex mixture of awe, tenderness, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked softly. Xavier's eyes widened. I don't know how." "Like this," Katherine demonstrated, then carefully transferred the swaddled infant to Xavier's arms, guiding him on how to support the baby's head. The sight of this tall, strong man holding her newborn son with such gentle care brought fresh tears to Katherine's eyes. Xavier looked down at the baby with wonder, his weathered face softening as the tiny boy yawned and blinked up at him with unfocused eyes. "He's perfect," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "What will you name him?" Katherine had thought long and hard about this during the lonely months of her pregnancy. "James," she said now. "James Michael Sullivan, after his father and grandfather." Xavier nodded approvingly. "A strong name for a strong boy." As dawn broke over Aztec, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dr. Wilson pronounced both mother and child healthy despite the premature birth. "The boy is small, but his lungs are good and he has a strong grip," he told them. "With proper care, he should thrive." Xavier insisted on paying the doctor's fee despite Katherine's protests. "You'll need your savings for the baby," he said firmly. "Please, Katherine, let me do this." Too exhausted to argue, she acquiesced, allowing Xavier to make the arrangements for a wagon to transport them back to her house once Dr. Wilson deemed them fit to travel. It was mid-afternoon before they were settled in her small bedroom. Baby James sleeping peacefully in the cradle, Xavier had purchased and assembled during Catherine's last month of pregnancy, another of his thoughtful gestures that had become so integral to her life. "You should rest," Xavier said, standing awkwardly by the bedroom door as Catherine sat propped up in bed watching her son sleep. "I'll stay in the main room in case you need anything." "Xavier," Catherine called softly as he turned to go, "your proposition, the partnership you suggested." He paused, his expression carefully neutral. "There's no need to discuss that now, Catherine. You've been through an ordeal. There's time to consider options later." "No," Catherine said with quiet determination. "I want to give you my answer now." She took a deep breath, looking from her newborn son to the man who had proven himself more dependable and caring than she could have hoped for in these difficult months. "I accept your offer. I think a partnership between us could be beneficial for all concerned, especially James." Xavier's face remained impassive, but she saw the flicker of something relief, pleasure in his eyes. "You're sure? I don't want you to feel pressured by circumstances." Catherine smiled, exhausted but certain. "Life is circumstances, Xavier. It's what we make of them that defines us, and I think we could make something good together." The smile that spread across Xavier's face then was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Then we have a deal, Katherine Sullivan." He hesitated, then added softly, "And perhaps, in time, who knows what else might grow from such a partnership." As he left the room to allow her to rest, Catherine gazed down at her sleeping son, then out the window where the afternoon sun gilded the dusty streets of Aztec. 3 months ago, she had been drowning in grief and isolation, facing a future that seemed bleak and uncertain. Now, against all odds, she found herself with a healthy son, meaningful work, and the prospect of a new beginning with a man whose strength was matched only by his kindness. It wasn't the life she had planned, but as Xavier had said, few of us end up where we expected. The question was whether happiness could be found in the unexpected turns, and Catherine was beginning to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, it could. The weeks following James's birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and adjustment for Catherine. Despite his early arrival, James proved to be a robust baby with a healthy appetite and strong lungs that he exercised frequently during the night hours. Xavier was a constant presence, dividing his time between his duties at the Broken Spur and helping Catherine establish a routine with the new baby. Word of their arrangement spread quickly through Aztec, as such news inevitably did in small western towns. Reactions were mixed. Some approved of the practical solution to Catherine's predicament, while others, particularly Harriet Jenkins and her circle, found fresh fodder for their gossip mills. "Living in sin, that's what it is," Harriet was overheard saying at the Mercantile. "That poor Sullivan baby, born into such irregular circumstances." But Catherine found she cared less about such opinions than she once had. The security of Xavier's partnership and the joy of her healthy son provided a buffer against the petty judgments of those who had offered no help when she needed it most. By the time James was a month old, Xavier had finalized the purchase of land from Mr. Hemingway, 50 acres of promising territory, with access to a year-round creek and good grazing land for cattle. He had also secured a modest herd to start their operation: 20 head of Hereford cattle, 2 milk cows, and 4 horses, including his own reliable gelding, Thunder. "It's not much," he admitted as he spread a rough map of the property on Catherine's kitchen table one evening. "But it's good land with potential. The previous owner built a small cabin here," he pointed to a mark on the paper, "near the creek. It's basic but sound. I've been working on expanding it, added another room already, and started on a proper kitchen." Catherine studied the map, trying to envision this new home while James nursed contentedly at her breast. Xavier, with typical consideration, kept his eyes carefully on the map, giving her privacy while still including her in the conversation. "When do you think we might be able to move in?" she asked, adjusting James as he finished his meal. "Another 2 weeks should see the essential work completed," Xavier replied. The roof needs some patching, and I want to make sure the stove is properly installed before bringing you and James out there. Winter's coming, and though it's mild in these parts compared to Colorado, we'll still need reliable heat. Katherine nodded, impressed by his thoroughness. And what about my teaching commitment to the Taylors? Their place is in the opposite direction from the ranch. I've thought about that, Xavier said, finally meeting her eyes now that James was settled. Their oldest boy, Robert, is a good rider. I've arranged with Mr. Taylor for him to come collect you 3 mornings a week with their buggy. It adds some time to your journey, but it seems the best solution until James is old enough for you to ride comfortably on your own. Once again, Katherine was struck by Xavier's thoughtfulness, the way he considered all aspects of their situation without assuming control or dismissing her needs. It was so different from what she often observed in other marriages, where wives were expected to simply adapt to whatever circumstances their husbands dictated. "You continue to surprise me, Xavier Flanagan," she said softly. He looked up, a question in his blue eyes. "How so?" "The care you take with arrangements, the respect you show for my work and independence. It's not common in my experience." Xavier's expression turned serious. "My father taught me that a man who doesn't respect the people in his life isn't worthy of respect himself." "And my mother," he smiled slightly, "well, she was a force to be reckoned with. Would have boxed my ears if I'd ever suggested a woman's work was less important than a man's." "They sound like remarkable people," Katherine observed. "I wish I could have known them." "They would have liked you," Xavier said with certainty. "Especially my mother. She valued courage above most other qualities, and you, Katherine Sullivan, have that in abundance." The warmth in his voice caused a flutter in Katherine's chest that had nothing to do with maternal feelings. Over the past weeks, she had become increasingly aware of Xavier not just as a partner and friend, but as a man whose presence affected her in ways both unexpected and undeniable. The way his smile transformed his weathered face, the strength in his hands as he cradled James with such gentle care, the deep timbre of his voice as he read aloud from one of her books in the evening hours, all these things stirred emotions she had thought buried with Michael. The realization brought both guilt and confusion. Was it disloyal to Michael's memory to feel this way about another man? Or was it, perhaps, a natural progression of the heart's healing, this tentative awakening to new possibilities? "Katherine," Xavier's voice broke into her thoughts. "You've gone quiet. Have I said something wrong?" She shook her head, offering a reassuring smile. "Not at all. I was just thinking about the future, how different it looks now from what I imagined a few months ago." "Different in a good way, I hope," Xavier said, a hint of uncertainty in his tone. Katherine looked down at James, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at Xavier, this man who had transformed her life through simple acts of kindness and respect. "Yes," she said softly. "In the best possible way." The move to the ranch occurred on a crisp October morning, just as the cottonwoods along the creek were turning golden with autumn. Xavier arrived at dawn with a wagon borrowed from the Broken Spur, already loaded with supplies for their new home. Katherine's few possessions were quickly added: the rocking chair that had been a wedding gift from Michael's parents, the small chest containing her clothing and personal items, James's cradle, and the modest collection of baby clothes she had sewn during her pregnancy. As Xavier secured the last of the cargo, Katherine stood on the porch of the small house that had been her home for the past 2 years, James bundled against the morning chill in her arms. So many memories were contained within these walls: her early days with Michael, full of hope and plans for the future, the devastating news of his death, the long months of grief and isolation, and finally, the unexpected friendship that had blossomed into this new beginning. "Ready?" Xavier asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. Katherine took a deep breath, then nodded. "Yes, it's time to move forward." The journey to their new home took nearly 2 hours, following a winding trail that led away from the established roads and into more rugged terrain. As they traveled, Xavier pointed out landmarks and boundaries, his voice animated as he described his plans for the property. The south pasture needs clearing too many rocks for good grazing, but the northern section is prime land. I'm thinking we'll run the cattle there in summer, move them to the lower fields when winter sets in. Katherine listened, asking questions and offering suggestions, finding herself genuinely interested in the prospect of building this new life together. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, lulled by the steady motion of the wagon and the sound of their voices. When they finally crested a small rise and the cabin came into view, Katherine's breath caught in her throat. It was indeed modest, a simple log structure with a stone chimney, and a newly added lean-to that would serve as her bedroom, but Xavier had clearly put significant work into making it habitable. The roof was freshly shingled, the windows fitted with oiled paper to let in light while keeping out the wind, and a small porch had been added to the front, complete with a bench where one might sit to enjoy the view of the creek winding through the valley below. "It's not much," Xavier said, uncertainty creeping into his voice as he gauged her reaction. "Not like what you must have been used to in Colorado or even in town. But it's solid, and with time it's perfect," Katherine interrupted, her eyes taking in not just the cabin but the entire setting, the golden cottonwoods along the creek, the distant mesas glowing red in the morning light, the open sky that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. "Truly, Xavier, it's beautiful." The relief on his face was palpable as he helped her down from the wagon, carefully supporting her elbow while she balanced James in her other arm. "Let me show you the inside," he said, leading her to the door. "I've tried to arrange things practically, but you'll want to make your own adjustments, I'm sure." The interior was simple but thoughtfully arranged. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a sturdy table and chairs positioned near the stone fireplace where a cast iron stove had been installed. Shelves lined one wall, holding the essential supplies Xavier had already stocked: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, and other staples. A door led to the new addition, which contained a narrow bed with a straw mattress, a small table that could serve as a washstand, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothing. "My quarters are in the loft," Xavier explained, pointing to a ladder that led to a space above the main room. "I thought you and James would prefer the privacy of a separate room." Katherine nodded, deeply touched by his consideration. "You've thought of everything," she said softly. "Not everything," Xavier admitted with a small smile. "I'm sure there are 100 things a woman would know that I've overlooked, but we'll address those as they arise." They spent the remainder of the day unpacking and organizing, establishing a space that gradually began to feel like a home rather than simply a shelter. Xavier had erected a clothesline between two trees near the cabin, and Katherine hung the freshly laundered linens she had brought, taking pleasure in the sight of them billowing in the autumn breeze against the backdrop of golden trees and blue sky. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Xavier built a fire in the stove and prepared a simple meal: beans, bacon, and the fresh bread Katherine had baked the day before in preparation for their move. They ate together at the new table, James sleeping in his cradle nearby, the warm glow of the lamp casting their shadows against the log walls. "It feels like a beginning, doesn't it?" Katherine observed, looking around the simple room that was now their home. "A fresh start for all of us." Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful as he studied her across the table. "That was my hope, that we could build something here that would give us both what we need: security, purpose, a place to belong. And James," Katherine added, glancing at her sleeping son. "A place for him to grow up healthy and free." "Yes, James too," Xavier agreed, his voice softening as it always did when he spoke of the baby. Over the past month, he had developed a deep attachment to the child, often volunteering to walk with him when he was fussing or simply sitting with him on the porch, telling him stories about the land and animals as if the infant could understand every word. As they cleared away the dishes together, moving in the easy rhythm they had established during their evenings at Catherine's house in town. She found herself watching Xavier's profile in the lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the slight curl of dark hair at the nape of his neck, the careful precision with which his hands performed even the most mundane tasks. "What is it?" he asked, catching her gaze. "You're staring." Katherine felt her cheeks warm but didn't look away. "I was just thinking how fortunate James and I are to have found you when we did. You've changed our lives, Xavier." He set down the plate he was drying, his blue eyes serious as they met hers. "You've changed mine as well, Katherine, more than you know." There was something in his voice, a depth of feeling that resonated with her own confused emotions. For a long moment they stood there, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities, until James stirred in his cradle, breaking the spell with his soft whimpers that quickly escalated into hungry cries. "He needs feeding," Katherine said, moving toward the cradle. "And it's getting late." "We should probably settle in for the night," Xavier nodded, stepping back to give her space. "Of course. I'll just bank the fire and head up to the loft. Call if you need anything during the night." As Katherine nursed James in the privacy of her new room, listening to the soft sounds of Xavier moving about the main room, preparing for sleep, she found herself contemplating the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a grieving widow facing an uncertain future alone. Now she was a mother and partner in a new enterprise, living under the same roof with a man who had come to mean more to her than she had thought possible. Their arrangement was practical, born of mutual need and respect rather than romance. Yet there was no denying the growing attraction between them, the way her pulse quickened when his hand accidentally brushed hers, the warmth that spread through her when he smiled. Was it too soon to be feeling this way? Michael had been gone only 6 months, and though she would always honor his memory as James's father, Katherine was beginning to understand that grief and love were not finite resources that, once spent, were gone forever. Perhaps the heart was more resilient than she had believed, capable of expanding to accommodate new attachments without diminishing the ones that came before. As James drifted off to sleep, milk-drunk and content, Katherine gently placed him in his cradle and prepared for bed herself. Through the thin wall that separated her room from the main cabin, she could hear Xavier climbing the ladder to the loft, his footsteps soft but distinct on the wooden rungs. "Good night, Xavier," she called softly. There was a pause, then his deep voice replied, "Good night, Katherine. Sleep well." As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their new home, the soft whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the distant call of a night bird, the gentle creaking of the cabin settling, Katherine felt a sense of peace stealing over her. This was not the life she had planned, but perhaps it was the life she needed, one built on mutual respect and shared purpose, with the possibility of deeper connection growing naturally over time. With that thought, she drifted into sleep, her dreams filled with golden light and open horizons, and a tall figure walking beside her toward a future full of promise. The rhythms of ranch life quickly established themselves in the weeks that followed. Xavier rose before dawn each day, tending to the livestock and outdoor chores before Katherine and James were even stirring. By the time she had breakfast prepared, he would return to the cabin, bringing with him the crisp scent of morning air and the quiet satisfaction of work well begun. 3 days a week, Robert Taylor would arrive with the buggy to transport Katherine to his family's homestead for the children's lessons. Xavier had built a sturdy carrying basket for James, allowing Katherine to keep the baby with her during these teaching sessions. Margaret Taylor had proven to be a true friend, often taking the infant for a while to give Katherine uninterrupted time with the children, and providing companionship that Katherine had sorely missed during her isolation in town. "You're looking well," Margaret commented one morning as they watched the children practicing their penmanship. "Ranch life must agree with you," Katherine smiled, glancing over at James, who was contentedly sleeping in his basket. "It does, surprisingly." I never imagined myself as a rancher's wife partner, she corrected herself quickly. Margaret's knowing look made Katherine blush. Partner, wife. Labels matter less than feelings, my dear, and anyone with eyes can see how that man looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. It's complicated, Katherine demurred, though her heart quickened at Margaret's words. We have an arrangement that works for both of us. Margaret hummed noncommittally. Well, arrangements have a way of evolving, especially when they involve people as well-suited as you two seem to be. On the days she wasn't teaching, Katherine focused on establishing their home, planting a small kitchen garden that would yield vegetables in the spring, preserving the last of the autumn harvest they'd purchased from neighboring farms, and working on the quilt she was making from scraps of fabric, a winter project that filled the evening hours as she and Xavier sat by the fire, he whittling or mending harness while she stitched, and they talked about everything and nothing. It was during these quiet evenings that their relationship deepened, moving beyond the practical partnership they had initially agreed upon. They shared stories from their pasts, discoveries about their present circumstances, and increasingly, hopes for their shared future. I'm thinking we should add a proper porch along the south side come spring, Xavier said one evening as he worked on fashioning a new handle for the water bucket. Gets the best light, and it would be a good place for James to play as he gets bigger. Katherine looked up from her stitching, struck by the casual way Xavier included James in his plans, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to consider the child's needs and future. That sounds perfect, she agreed. And perhaps a small fenced area adjacent to it. Someplace safe for him to explore when he starts crawling. Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful. We could plant some fruit trees too. Take a few years to bear, but by the time he's running around, there might be apples or peaches for him to pick. These conversations, focused on a future they were building together, gradually eroded the careful boundaries they had established. Though they maintained separate sleeping quarters, and Xavier was unfailingly respectful of Katherine's independence, there was no denying the growing intimacy between them, not physical, but emotional, a deepening connection that manifested in small ways throughout their daily interactions. It was the way Xavier's hand would linger when he passed her a cup of coffee in the morning, the way Katherine found herself watching for his return when he was working the far pastures. The way they had begun to anticipate each other's needs, moving in a dance of mutual consideration that required no words. As November drew to a close, bringing colder temperatures and the promise of winter, they faced their first challenge as partners. A sudden illness swept through the area, affecting both humans and livestock. Several of their calves developed a respiratory ailment that required constant monitoring, and Xavier spent long hours in the barn, administering remedies suggested by the veterinarian who had ridden out from Farmington. On the third night of this vigil, Katherine bundled James warmly and carried him to the barn, where she found Xavier slumped against a stall door, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "You need rest," she said softly, approaching him with a covered basket containing a thermos of hot coffee and the stew she had kept warming for him. "You won't be any good to these animals if you make yourself sick." Xavier looked up, surprise giving way to gratitude as he registered her presence. "I didn't want to leave them," he explained, accepting the coffee she poured. "The smallest one seems to be turning a corner, but the other two are still struggling." Katherine settled beside him on a hay bale, adjusting James in her arms. "Then we'll take shifts. You eat and get a few hours sleep in the cabin. I'll wake you if there's any change." Xavier started to protest, but was interrupted by a jaw-cracking yawn that made his argument less than convincing. "You have James to consider," he said weakly. "James and I will be fine for a few hours," Katherine assured him. "The barn is warm enough with the lantern and he's bundled well. Besides, he seems fascinated by the animals." Indeed, the baby was wide awake, his dark eyes tracking the movements of the calves in their stalls with evident interest. At nearly 3 months, he was becoming more alert and responsive each day, a source of endless wonder and joy for both Katherine and Xavier. After some further persuasion, Xavier reluctantly agreed to her plan, finishing the stew and showing her what needed to be done for each calf, before heading to the cabin for a few hours of much-needed rest. Katherine settled in for her watch, James cradled in one arm while she used her free hand to stroke the forehead of the smallest calf, a red and white heifer that gazed at her with liquid brown eyes. "You'll be all right, little one," she murmured. "Just keep fighting." The hours passed slowly, marked by the soft sounds of the animals breathing and James's occasional coos. Katherine sang softly to pass the time, old lullabies her mother had sung to her, their familiar melodies bringing comfort in the dimly lit barn. She must have dozed off despite her intentions, for the next thing she knew, a gentle hand was on her shoulder and Xavier's voice was in her ear. "Katherine, wake up, sweetheart." The endearment, spoken without apparent thought, sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the lantern's glow. She blinked up at him, disoriented for a moment. "What time is it?" "Nearly dawn," Xavier said, taking James carefully from her arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, nestling comfortably against Xavier's chest in a way that made Katherine's heart constrict with tenderness. "You should have woken me sooner. You needed the rest," she said, stretching to ease the stiffness in her neck and back. "How are the calves?" Xavier's tired face broke into a smile. "Better, all of them. The little heifer's fever has broken and the other two are eating again. I think we've turned the corner." "Thank goodness," Katherine breathed, genuine relief washing over her. These animals represented not just financial investment, but the future of their small ranch. Each loss would have been a significant setback. As they walked back to the cabin together in the pre-dawn light, James still sleeping peacefully in Xavier's arms, Katherine was struck by how naturally they had worked together to face this crisis, dividing responsibilities, supporting each other, united in purpose. It felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate, this partnership that had grown from pragmatic arrangement into something much deeper. Inside the cabin, as Xavier carefully transferred the sleeping baby to his cradle, Katherine found herself watching the gentleness of his weathered hands, the tender care with which he tucked the blanket around James's small form. When he straightened, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, not just between them as partners, but as a family unit, unconventional though it might be. "Thank you," Xavier said quietly, "for coming to the barn tonight." "For sharing the burden," Katherine smiled, fatigue making her less guarded than usual. "That's what partners do, isn't it? Share the load, face challenges together." Xavier's expression softened, his blue eyes warm in the dim light of the cabin. "Yes," he agreed. "That's exactly what they do." He hesitated, then added, "But I think what we have may have become more than just a practical partnership, Katherine, at least for me." Her heart stuttered in her chest, but before she could respond, he continued, "You don't have to say anything now. I know it's complicated, with your grief for Michael still fresh and James so young. I wanted you to know that my feelings for you have grown beyond what I anticipated when I proposed this arrangement." Katherine swallowed hard, emotions tangling in her chest, affection for this good man, lingering grief for Michael, guilt at the prospect of opening her heart again so soon, and yet, undeniably, hope for what might be possible between them. "Xavier," she began, then faltered, unsure how to express the complexity of her feelings. He shook his head, giving her a gentle smile. "No need for words, Katherine, not yet. We have time." He glanced toward the window where the first light of dawn was painting the sky in pale gold. "It's been a long night. We should both get some rest while James is sleeping." With that, he touched her shoulder briefly, the contact warm through the fabric of her dress, then moved toward the ladder that led to his loft quarters. Katherine watched him go, her mind awhirl with possibilities, with questions, with the dawning realization that what had begun as a practical solution to their respective problems had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, but something that felt increasingly right and natural, like the changing of seasons or the flow of the creek through their land. As she prepared for a few hours of sleep in her own room, Katherine found herself contemplating the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief of losing Michael would always be a part of her, a shadow that would never completely fade. But perhaps she was beginning to understand that shadow needn't define the rest of her life. Perhaps there was room for new joy, new connection, new love, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a continuation of life's rich and complex tapestry. With that thought warming her heart, Katherine slipped into a deep and peaceful sleep, dreaming of spring planting and summer harvests, of James taking his first steps across the cabin floor, of Xavier's smile in the golden light of sunset, dreams not of what was, but of what might be. The winter solstice brought the first significant snowfall to their valley, transforming the landscape into a pristine expanse of white that glittered in the clear December sunlight. Katherine stood on the porch, James bundled against her chest, watching as Xavier chopped additional firewood, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The week since their night in the barn had seen a subtle shift in their relationship. Though Xavier had not pressed the issue of his feelings, there was a new awareness between them, a current of unspoken possibility that colored their daily interactions. Small touches lingered longer, glances held more meaning, and increasingly, Katherine found herself wondering what it would be like to truly become Xavier's wife in all senses of the word. The thought no longer brought the sharp pang of guilt it once had. Michael would always hold a special place in her heart as James's father and her first love, but she had come to understand that honoring his memory didn't require her to close her heart to new possibilities. Life was for the living, and she was still very much alive, with needs and desires that had been dormant but never extinguished. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Xavier said, pausing in his work to join her on the porch, axe resting against his shoulder. "First snow always makes everything look new again." Katherine nodded, adjusting James's blanket to shield him from a sudden gust of wind. "I was just thinking that very thing, a fresh start, like nature is wiping the slate clean." Xavier studied her face, snowflakes catching in his dark hair and on the shoulders of his heavy coat. "Speaking of fresh starts," he began, his expression turning serious, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Katherine's heart quickened, but before Xavier could continue, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Turning toward the trail that led from the main road, they saw a rider approaching through the snow, the horse moving carefully over the unfamiliar white terrain. "Were you expecting anyone?" Xavier asked, instantly alert, his hand moving to the rifle that was never far from reach in this isolated territory. Katherine shook her head. "No, perhaps it's a message from the Taylors." As the rider drew closer, Katherine could make out the figure of a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, bundled against the cold but clearly struggling with the elements. When he reached the yard in front of the cabin, he dismounted stiffly, his movements suggesting he had been riding for some time in the frigid weather. "Hello there," Xavier called, setting aside his axe and moving forward to greet the stranger. "Can we help you?" The young man pushed back his snow-covered hat, revealing a face that was vaguely familiar to Katherine, though she couldn't immediately place it. "I'm looking for Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Katherine Sullivan. I was told in town she might be found out this way." Katherine stepped forward, curiosity overcoming caution. "I'm Katherine Sullivan, and you are." The young man's face registered relief, then a strange mix of emotions, anxiety, hope, and something like determination. "Madam, my name is Thomas Riley. I worked with your husband in the mine before." "Before the accident?" Katherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You knew Michael?" "Yes, madam," Riley nodded, glancing nervously between Katherine and Xavier, who had moved protectively closer to her. "We were friends of a sort, worked the same section for nearly a year." Xavier's expression was guarded as he assessed the young man. You've ridden a long way through snow to find Mrs. Sullivan. Must be important business. Riley swallowed visibly, then nodded. It is, sir, very important, and private if you don't mind. Xavier's posture stiffened, but Katherine laid a gentle hand on his arm. It's all right, Xavier. Mr. Riley knew Michael. I'd like to hear what he has to say. She turned to the young miner, but first you should come inside and warm yourself. You look half frozen. Despite obvious reluctance, Xavier nodded, gesturing toward the cabin. I'll see to your horse. He needs shelter and feed after that journey. Riley thanked him, then followed Katherine into the cabin, removing his hat and coat at her instruction, and taking a seat near the stove where the warmth could begin to thaw his chilled limbs. Katherine busied herself preparing coffee, her mind racing with possibilities. What could this man, this friend of Michael's, want with her after all this time? When Xavier joined them a few minutes later, having stabled Riley's horse in the barn, the young miner had regained some color in his face and was cradling the mug of coffee Katherine had provided. James had been settled in his cradle, temporarily fascinated by a small wooden toy suspended above him, another of Xavier's creations. Now, Mr. Riley, Katherine said, taking a seat across from him. What brings you all this way in such weather? Riley set down his coffee, his hands still trembling slightly from cold or nervousness. Mrs. Sullivan, what I have to tell you is difficult, and I've wrestled with whether to come forward at all, but I can't keep silent any longer, not when it affects you and your child. Xavier moved to stand behind Katherine's chair, his presence solid and reassuring. Perhaps you should get to the point, Mr. Riley, he suggested, his tone polite but firm. Riley nodded, drawing a deep breath. Mrs. Sullivan, the mine collapse that killed your husband and the others. It wasn't an accident, at least not entirely. Katherine felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. What do you mean? The company knew those support beams were failing, Riley continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Michael had reported it multiple times, demanded replacements. But replacing them would have meant shutting down production for at least a week, and there were contracts to fulfill, quotas to meet. Xavier's hand came to rest on Katherine's shoulder, a silent gesture of support as she absorbed this devastating information. Are you saying the company deliberately ignored safety concerns? He asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Yes, sir, that's exactly what I'm saying, Riley confirmed. And worse than that. After Michael's last report, which was particularly forceful, there was talk among the managers about dismissing him. He was becoming, in their words, a troublesome element. Katherine's mind flashed back to the days before the accident, how agitated Michael had been, how he'd stayed late at the mine office arguing with the superintendent. He was trying to protect everyone, she whispered. That's why he was working late shifts, checking those supports himself. Riley nodded grimly. The night of the collapse, he'd gathered evidence measurements showing how much the beams had deteriorated, dates of his previous reports that had been ignored. He was planning to take it to the territorial authorities if the company didn't act immediately. A terrible suspicion began to form in Katherine's mind. Mr. Riley, are you suggesting that the collapse, that it wasn't? She couldn't bring herself to complete the thought. Riley's expression was grave. I don't know for certain, Mrs. Sullivan. I want to be clear about that. But I do know that one of the foremen, a man named Garrett who was close to the superintendent, was in that section shortly before the collapse, carrying tools that had no legitimate purpose there. Xavier's grip on Katherine's shoulder tightened. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Riley. Tampering with mine supports would be murder. I know, sir, Riley acknowledged. That's why I've waited so long to come forward. I wasn't sure and I was afraid. The company has influence throughout the territory. Why now? Katherine asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Why come to me with this after all these months? Riley looked down at his hands, then back up, meeting her eyes directly. Because I'm leaving the territory, heading to California to start fresh. And I couldn't go knowing I'd kept silent about something that might affect what's owed to you and your child. Owed? Xavier repeated, his tone sharp. If the company was negligent or worse, deliberately caused the collapse, they'd be liable for much more than the modest pension they've provided, Riley explained. There could be significant compensation due to all the widows and families, especially Michael's, since he documented the problems so thoroughly. Katherine sat back, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. If what Riley said was true, Michael's death might have been not just preventable but intentional, a horrifying thought that made her physically ill. And yet, there was also the practical consideration: compensation that could secure James's future in a way the meager mining pension never could. "Do you have proof of any of this?" Xavier asked, his rational mind focusing on the practical aspects while Katherine grappled with the emotional impact. Riley reached into his inside pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This is a copy of the last report Michael filed, detailing the condition of the supports. I took it from the office the day after the collapse, before the company could destroy all evidence. It has his signature, dates, specific measurements. And I'm willing to provide a sworn statement about what I saw that day and heard in the weeks leading up to it." Katherine took the paper with trembling hands, recognizing Michael's neat, precise handwriting documenting in methodical detail the dangerous conditions he'd observed. It was dated just 2 days before the collapse, with a note at the bottom: "Third formal request for immediate action, catastrophic failure imminent without replacement of listed supports." There would be a fight, Xavier said thoughtfully, thinking through the implications. The company would deny everything, use their influence to discredit the claims. "Yes, sir," Riley agreed. "But with this documentation, plus testimony from other miners who were aware of the situation, several of whom I believe would come forward if someone took the lead, there's a case to be made. Especially given the territory's increasing concern about mine safety after several recent disasters." Katherine looked up from the document, her eyes meeting Xavier's. In his steady gaze, she found the strength she needed to consider this rationally, despite the emotional turmoil it caused. "What would we need to do?" she asked Riley. "Take this information to a reputable lawyer in Santa Fe or Albuquerque," he advised. "Someone not in the mining company's pocket. File a formal claim for negligence, gather supporting statements from other miners and widows. It won't be quick or easy, but," he glanced at James in his cradle, "it could make a real difference for your son's future." The conversation continued for another hour, with Riley providing additional details about the mine's operations, the specific individuals involved, and potential witnesses who might corroborate his account. By the time they had exhausted the topic, the short winter day was drawing to a close, darkness falling early over the snow-covered landscape. "You should stay the night, Mr. Riley," Xavier offered, practical considerations overriding any lingering suspicion. The trail back to town would be treacherous in darkness, especially with snow on the ground. Riley accepted gratefully, and arrangements were made for him to sleep on a pallet near the stove in the main room. After a simple but hearty supper, the young miner retired early, exhausted from his journey and the emotional strain of sharing his long-held information. Left alone in the kitchen as Xavier checked on the livestock one final time before nightfall, Katherine found herself staring at Michael's report, tracing her fingers over his familiar handwriting. The revelation that his death might not have been an accident opened wounds she had thought were beginning to heal, bringing fresh grief and a new emotion: anger at the company that had valued profit over human lives. When Xavier returned, stamping snow from his boots at the door, he found her still at the table, tears streaming silently down her face. Without a word, he pulled his chair close to hers and gathered her into his arms, offering comfort through presence rather than platitudes. "What do I do with this, Xavier?" she whispered against his shoulder. "If what Riley says is true, then Michael didn't just die, he was killed trying to protect others. And James," her voice broke, "James deserves to know that about his father someday." deserves whatever justice we can secure for him." Xavier stroked her hair gently, his voice soft but resolute. "Then we'll pursue it, Katherine, together. We'll find a lawyer, present the evidence, fight for what's rightfully yours and James's." Katherine pulled back slightly to look at him, struck by his immediate inclusion of himself in this fight that predated his presence in her life. "This isn't your battle, Xavier. I couldn't ask you to take this on." His blue eyes were steady as they met hers. "You didn't ask. I'm offering. What affects you and James affects me now. We're partners, remember?" The word partners hung between them, loaded with meaning that had evolved far beyond their initial arrangement. Katherine studied his face in the warm glow of the lamp. This man who had entered her life so unexpectedly yet had become so essential to it. The strength of his character, his unwavering support, the gentleness beneath his rugged exterior all had combined to create feelings in her that could no longer be denied or diminished. "Xavier," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with tentative fingers. "I think we've become more than partners, haven't we?" His breath caught, hope and caution warring in his expression. "Katherine, I don't want you to feel," she silenced him by pressing her fingers gently against his lips. "I know my own mind, Xavier Flanagan, and my own heart." She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I will always honor Michael's memory, especially now, knowing how bravely he fought to protect his fellow miners. But I've come to understand that loving him doesn't prevent me from loving you too." The word loving hung in the air between them, a declaration Katherine hadn't planned but felt with absolute certainty as she spoke it. Xavier's eyes widened, then softened with an emotion so profound it made her heart ache. "Katherine," he whispered, covering her hand with his own, turning it to press a kiss into her palm. "Are you certain? There's no rush, no pressure. I can wait as long as I'm certain," she interrupted, her voice stronger now. "Life is unpredictable and often too short, as we both know all too well. I don't want to waste precious time denying what's in my heart out of fear or convention." Xavier's smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his weathered face with joy. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "I love you, Katherine Sullivan," he said simply. "Have almost from the moment I saw you in that store, standing tall despite everything you were facing. Your courage, your kindness, your strength, they humble me every day." Katherine closed her eyes, absorbing his words, letting them sink into places within her that had been cold and empty for too long. When she opened them again, she found Xavier watching her with such tenderness that it brought fresh tears to her eyes, not of grief this time, but of a happiness she had thought might never be hers again. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Katherine closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as months of suppressed feelings found expression. Xavier's arms encircled her, drawing her closer, his touch reverent yet passionate, communicating without words all that had remained unspoken between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, Katherine rested her head against Xavier's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, blanketing their small ranch in pristine white, while inside, the warmth of the fire and this newfound intimacy created a haven against the winter night. "What happens now?" Katherine asked softly. Xavier's chest rumbled with a gentle laugh. "Whatever we want, Katherine. We face this mining company together, we build our ranch, we raise James." He hesitated, then added, "And perhaps when you're ready, we make our partnership official in the eyes of the law and the church." Katherine smiled against his shirt, happiness spreading through her like warmth from the fire. "I think I'd like that very much, Xavier Flanagan." In the cradle nearby, James stirred and made the small sounds that heralded waking. Xavier reluctantly loosened his embrace, allowing Katherine to rise and tend to her son. As she lifted the baby, Now fully awake and regarding them with curious dark eyes, Xavier moved to join them, his arm slipping naturally around Catherine's waist as they stood together. A family formed not by blood or conventional paths, but by choice and circumstance and the resilient human capacity for love. "Hello, young man," Xavier said softly to James, who responded with a toothless smile that melted both their hearts. "Your mother and I have some plans to discuss, and you're a very important part of them." Katherine leaned into Xavier's solid presence, her son warm and secure in her arms, and felt the future opening before them, uncertain in its details, perhaps, but rich with possibility and the promise of shared joy. From the darkest moment of her life had come this unexpected gift, a second chance at happiness, a new family formed from grief and kindness, and the remarkable journey that had brought them together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the old tracks and laying down a pristine surface upon which new paths could be made come morning. Inside, three people whose lives had been marked by loss found themselves bound together by something stronger: the love that transforms strangers into family, and a house into a home. The journey to Santa Fe to pursue the case against the mining company took place in early spring, when the snow had melted and the trails were passable again. By then, much had changed at the small ranch Xavier had named Cottonwood Creek, after the trees that lined the waterway running through their property. Most significantly, on a clear February morning, Katherine and Xavier had exchanged vows in a simple ceremony at the Taylor homestead, with the family serving as witnesses and James, now 6 months old and sitting proudly in Margaret Taylor's lap, attending as guest of honor. Reverend Johnson from the church in Aztec had performed the service, making official what had been true in their hearts for months: that they were a family, bound by choice and love rather than mere circumstance. The wedding night had been a revelation for Katherine, who had feared that intimacy might be awkward or strained after months of maintaining careful boundaries. Instead, she discovered in Xavier a tender and considerate lover, whose patience and gentle guidance helped her bridge the gap between her past and present, honoring her memories while creating new ones that belonged solely to them. In the weeks that followed, they had settled into their new relationship with a naturalness that suggested it had always been inevitable. Xavier moved his belongings from the loft to Catherine's room, which he expanded to accommodate them both comfortably. The loft was converted into storage space, with plans to eventually create a proper bedroom there for James when he was older. The ranch had begun to prosper under their joint efforts. The small herd increased with the birth of several healthy calves. The kitchen garden Katherine had planted the previous fall began to yield early greens and radishes, and Xavier had established a reputation in the area for his fair dealing and reliable work. Neighboring ranchers sometimes hired him for specialized tasks like breaking particularly difficult horses or helping with complex construction projects, providing additional income beyond what their own operation generated. As they prepared for the journey to Santa Fe, Katherine found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a year. From the lowest point of despair, a pregnant widow facing social ostracism and financial insecurity, to this: a new husband who cherished her, a healthy son who grew stronger each day, and a home that, while modest, was filled with warmth and purpose. "Are you certain you want to undertake this journey?" Xavier asked as they packed for the trip. "It will be difficult, facing the mining company representatives, reliving those events." Katherine nodded, folding a clean dress into their travel bag. "I'm certain, for Michael's sake and for James. He deserves to know someday that his father died trying to protect others, and that we fought for justice in his name." Xavier smiled, drawing her into a brief embrace. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known, Katherine Flanagan." The name still felt new on her tongue, but right in a way she hadn't expected. Katherine Flanagan, wife of Xavier, mother of James, mistress of Cottonwood Creek Ranch. A woman with a past honored but not imprisoning her, and a future bright with possibility. The lawyer they had engaged, a Mr. Thornton recommended by the territorial judge in Albuquerque, had prepared them for a difficult battle. The Sullivan Mining Company was influential, with connections throughout the territory and significant resources to fight any claims against them. But Thomas Riley's evidence, combined with statements Xavier had quietly gathered from other miners and widows over the winter months, formed a compelling case of negligence at minimum and possibly criminal disregard for human life. "It won't be quick," Xavier warned as they loaded their wagon for the journey. "Mr. Thornton says these cases can drag on for months, even years." "Then we'll be patient," Katherine replied, securing James in the carrying basket they had fashioned for him. "The truth deserves to be told, however long it takes." The trip to Santa Fe took 5 days, with stops at friendly homesteads along the way where they could rest and refresh themselves. James proved to be a remarkably good traveler, content to observe the changing landscape from his basket or sleep to the rhythm of the wagon wheels on the trail. Santa Fe itself was a revelation to Katherine, who had never visited the territorial capital. The blend of Spanish, Native American, and American influences created an atmosphere unlike any she had experienced, with adobe buildings surrounding the central plaza, merchants selling wares from across the continent, and a cosmopolitan population that included people of various backgrounds and nationalities. They took rooms at a modest but clean boarding house recommended by Mr. Thornton, who met with them the evening of their arrival to review their case and prepare them for the depositions scheduled for the following day. "The company representatives will try to discredit your late husband's reports," he warned Katherine, a serious man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a methodical approach. "They'll suggest he was disgruntled, perhaps even incompetent. You must be prepared for unpleasant accusations." Katherine nodded, her hand finding Xavier's for support. "I understand. Michael was neither of those things, and his documentation speaks for itself." "Indeed it does," Thornton agreed. "And Mr. Riley's testimony corroborates the timeline and the company's awareness of the dangerous conditions. The fact that other miners and several widows have provided statements further strengthens our position." The deposition the following day was as difficult as they had anticipated. The mining company's lawyers were aggressive, questioning every detail of Michael's reports and suggesting that his concerns were exaggerated to cover his own inadequacies as a foreman. They implied that the collapse was due to an unforeseeable geological event rather than structural failure, and that any claims to the contrary were motivated by greed and opportunism. Throughout the grueling session, Xavier remained at Katherine's side, his presence a steadying influence as she maintained her composure and responded clearly and factually to each question. When they attempted to suggest that her remarriage so soon after Michael's death indicated a lack of genuine grief and, by extension, cast doubt on her motives in pursuing the case, Xavier's barely contained anger was evident in the tension of his jaw and the protective way he shifted closer to her. "Mrs. Flanagan's personal life is not relevant to the facts of this case," Mr. Thornton intervened smoothly. "The documentation provided by her late husband speaks for itself, as does Mr. Riley's sworn testimony regarding the company's knowledge of the dangerous conditions prior to the collapse." By the end of the day, Katherine was exhausted but satisfied that they had presented their case as strongly as possible. The mining company's representatives had been unable to refute the specific measurements and dates in Michael's reports, nor explain why no action had been taken despite repeated warnings. "You did well," Mr. Thornton told them as they left the courthouse. The judge seemed particularly interested in the pattern of ignored warnings. "That bodes well for our petition to have this recognized as a case of criminal negligence rather than simple accident." The process moved forward in the days that followed, with additional testimonies from miners who had traveled to Santa Fe at Xavier's expense to support Katherine's case. The evidence accumulated, painting a damning picture of a company that had consistently prioritized profit over safety, dismissing or suppressing concerns raised by its own foreman. While the legal proceedings continued, Katherine and Xavier found moments to explore Santa Fe together, James in tow. They visited the old Spanish mission church, strolled through the plaza where native artisans displayed their crafts, and enjoyed meals at small cantinas where the food was spicy and flavorful in ways Katherine had never experienced. "I could get used to this," Xavier admitted one evening as they sat in the small courtyard of their boarding house, James sleeping peacefully in a borrowed cradle while they shared a pot of coffee. The variety of it all, the different peoples and traditions mixing together. Katherine studied his face in the lamplight, the strong features that had become so dear to her. "Would you want to live in a city someday? Leave the ranch?" Xavier considered the question thoughtfully. "Not permanently," he decided. "I've lived too long under open skies to be happy confined by city walls, but visits like this now and then? Yes, I think that would be good for all of us, especially James as he grows. There's much to learn from different ways of life." Katherine nodded, pleased by his answer. She had come to love their small ranch, the rhythm of days marked by sunrise and sunset, the direct connection to the land and animals that sustained them. But she also valued the exposure to broader horizons that travel provided, the reminder that the world was vast and varied beyond their corner of the New Mexico territory. On the 10th day of their stay, Mr. Thornton summoned them to his office with unexpected news. The mining company, faced with mounting evidence and concerns about negative publicity that might affect their operations throughout the territory, had proposed a settlement. "They're offering compensation to all the families of miners lost in the collapse," Thornton explained, sliding a document across his desk. "With additional considerations for Mrs. Flanagan, as Michael Sullivan's documentation was instrumental in establishing their negligence." Katherine examined the proposed terms, her eyes widening at the figure offered. It was a substantial sum, far more than she had expected and enough to provide security for James's future education and opportunities. "There's a condition, of course," Thornton continued, his expression neutral. "Confidentiality. All parties would agree not to discuss the terms of the settlement or the company's acknowledgement of responsibility." Xavier frowned, his natural inclination toward justice making him suspicious of such conditions. "They want to buy silence, to prevent this from damaging their reputation or encouraging similar claims against other operations." "Essentially, yes," Thornton acknowledged. "Though I should note that, as part of the agreement, they will be implementing the safety improvements Michael Sullivan originally recommended, not just in the Aztec mine but across all their properties. A copy of his final report will be used as a training document for future foremen." Katherine considered this information, her thoughts turning to what Michael would have wanted. He had been a practical man, focused on protecting the miners under his supervision rather than seeking personal recognition. Would he consider this outcome a victory, despite the confidentiality requirements? "If we accept," she asked carefully, "does that prevent the territorial authorities from pursuing any criminal charges regarding the collapse?" Thornton shook his head. "The settlement pertains only to civil claims. The territorial prosecutor could still pursue criminal negligence charges if he chose to, though without your active participation, it's less likely." Xavier and Katherine exchanged a look, years of growing understanding allowing them to communicate without words. "We need time to consider this," Xavier said finally. "Can we give you our answer tomorrow?" "Of course," Thornton agreed. "It's a significant decision. Take the time you need." That evening, as James slept in their room at the boarding house, Katherine and Xavier sat in the small parlor downstairs, discussing their options in low voices. "The money would secure James's future," Katherine said, weighing the practical aspects. And the implementation of Michael's safety recommendations could save other miners' lives. Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful. But is it justice to allow them to hide their responsibility to avoid public accountability? Katherine reached for his hand, drawing strength from his unwavering sense of right and wrong. "I've been thinking about what Michael would want," she said slowly. "He wasn't a vengeful man. His primary concern was always the safety of his men. If his recommendations will be implemented, preventing future tragedies, I think he would consider that the most important outcome." Xavier studied her face in the lamplight, his blue eyes serious. "And what about you, Katherine? What do you want?" She considered the question carefully. "I want James to grow up knowing his father was a good man who died trying to protect others. I want the security to provide him with opportunities Michael and I dreamed of for him, and I want—" She hesitated, then continued with conviction. "I want us to move forward to build our life together without the shadow of this fight hanging over us indefinitely." Xavier nodded slowly, understanding in his expression. "Then I think we have our answer." The following day, they met with Mr. Thornton to accept the settlement offer, with one additional condition Katherine insisted upon: a formal letter from the company acknowledging Michael Sullivan's efforts to improve mine safety and his role in developing the new standards that would be implemented. This letter would not be subject to the confidentiality agreement, allowing Katherine to share it with James when he was old enough to understand his father's legacy. Surprisingly, the company agreed to this condition with minimal resistance, perhaps recognizing that such a concession would help secure the broader silence they sought regarding their negligence. By the end of the week, the settlement was finalized, the funds transferred to an account established in James's name, with Katherine and Xavier as trustees until his majority. And the letter delivered on company letterhead, its formal language nevertheless clear in its recognition of Michael Sullivan's integrity and foresight. As they prepared to return home to Cottonwood Creek, Katherine felt a sense of completion, of a chapter closing that allowed a new one to open more fully. The justice they had secured was imperfect, as human justice often is, but it honored Michael's memory and provided for the son he had never known outcomes that brought a measure of peace she hadn't realized she still sought. "Are you ready to go home?" Xavier asked as he loaded their bags into the wagon for the journey back. Katherine smiled, the word home resonating with meaning beyond the simple cabin and land they shared. Home was Xavier's steady presence beside her, James's weight in her arms, the life they were building together on their own terms. "Yes," she said, settling James in his basket for the trip. "I'm ready to go home." The return journey to Cottonwood Creek took them through blooming spring landscapes, the arid terrain transformed by wildflowers and the fresh green of new growth. Along the way, they discussed plans for expanding the ranch operations with the additional security the settlement provided, perhaps purchasing more cattle, improving their water management systems, eventually building a larger home as their family grew. "Family," Xavier repeated when Katherine mentioned this, a smile spreading across his face. "You know, I never expected to have one of my own. Not after a leaner, thought I'd live out my days as a solitary cowhand, moving from ranch to ranch until I was too old to work." Katherine reached across the wagon seat to touch his arm, still sometimes amazed at the way life had brought them together through such unlikely circumstances. "And I never imagined finding love again after Michael, especially not so soon. Yet here we are." Xavier covered her hand with his own, his eyes briefly leaving the trail to meet hers. "Here we are indeed, a family." As they crested the final ridge and Cottonwood Creek came into view, the small cabin nestled among the trees with cattle grazing in the nearby pasture. Katherine felt a surge of gratitude for all that had transpired since that day in the general store, when a kind stranger had stepped forward to help a pregnant widow mocked by her neighbors. From that simple act of decency had grown a partnership, a love, and a future brighter than either of them could have imagined in their separate solitudes. Life's path was unpredictable, sometimes painfully so, but it also offered unexpected gifts to those brave enough to accept them. Home. They were home, not just to a place, but to each other. 5 years later, 1883, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the yard of Cottonwood Creek Ranch as Katherine stood on the porch, watching the scene before her with a heart full to bursting. Xavier was returning from the north pasture with 5-year-old James perched proudly on the saddle in front of him, the boy's small hands gripping the pommel while his stepfather's strong arm held him securely. Behind them came Robert Taylor, now 16 and working part-time at the ranch while continuing his education, leading a string of horses they had been training for a buyer from Colorado. "Mama, Mama," James called, spotting her on the porch. "Papa let me help with the horses." "I rode Thunder all by myself while Papa walked beside." Xavier's smile was indulgent as he reined in near the porch and swung down from the saddle, then lifted James carefully to the ground. "He's a natural horseman," he told Katherine, pride evident in his voice. "Sat straight as an arrow the whole time." Katherine ruffled her son's dark hair, so like Michael's in color and texture. "Well done, James, but remember, riding alone comes only when Papa says you're ready, not before." "Yes, Mama," James agreed, though his eager expression suggested he would be campaigning for more independent riding at the earliest opportunity. "Where's Ellie?" Xavier asked, removing his hat and wiping his brow with his sleeve. The early October day was warm, the kind of golden afternoon that made the coming winter seem like a distant possibility rather than an approaching certainty. "Napping, finally," Katherine replied, gesturing toward the house. "Mrs. Cooper is sitting with her while I prepared supper." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Abigail Cooper appeared in the doorway, a finger to her lips. "Still sleeping soundly," she reported in a whisper. "But I should be getting back to town before dark. Mr. Cooper will be wanting his supper." Katherine thanked the elderly woman who had become a regular helper at the ranch since the birth of Alina Ellie 15 months earlier. Named for Xavier's first love with his blessing, the little girl had her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, a combination that kept the entire household on their toes. As Mrs. Cooper departed in her small buggy, Robert led the horses to the corral, and James raced off to check on the litter of kittens recently discovered in the barn. Katherine and Xavier found themselves alone on the porch for the first time that busy day. "Tired?" Xavier asked, noting the shadows beneath his wife's eyes. Katherine smiled ruefully. "Ellie was fussy all morning. Teething again, I think, but she's sleeping now and we managed to get through most of the mending and some baking before she reached the limit of her patience." Xavier drew her into his arms, his embrace still sending a warmth through her that 5 years of marriage had not diminished. "You work too hard," he murmured against her hair. "Perhaps we should consider hiring more regular help now that the ranch is doing well." It was true that Cottonwood Creek had prospered beyond their initial modest hopes. With careful management of the settlement funds and Xavier's natural aptitude for ranching, they had expanded their operations significantly. The original 50 acres had grown to over 200. The cattle herd now numbered nearly 100 head, and the small cabin had been expanded into a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a comfortable parlor where Katherine taught not only James but several neighboring children 3 days a week. "Perhaps," Katherine conceded, leaning into her husband's solid strength. "Though I'd prefer someone young and willing to learn rather than an experienced housekeeper who might have fixed ideas about how things should be done." Xavier chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her cheek. "Always maintaining your independence, Mrs. Flanagan. It's one of the many things I love about you." Before Katherine could respond, a wail from inside the house announced that Ellie's nap had come to an end. Xavier released his wife with a quick kiss. "I'll get her. You rest for a moment." Katherine watched him disappear into the house. marveling as she often did at how naturally he had taken to fatherhood, first with James and now with Ellie. He had been there for James's first steps, his first words, his first ride on a gentle pony selected specifically for the purpose. Never once had he distinguished between the child born of Catherine's first marriage and the daughter they had created together. Both were equally his in every way that mattered. Moments later, Xavier reappeared with a sleep rumpled Ellie in his arms, her dark blonde curls standing up in all directions and her blue eyes, so like her father's, still heavy with interrupted sleep. "Look who's awake," he said, bouncing the toddler gently until she giggled despite her lingering grumpiness. "Should we go find your brother and those kittens he's so excited about?" Ellie perked up at the mention of kittens, her small face lighting with interest. Kit," she exclaimed, her limited vocabulary nevertheless clear in its enthusiasm. Xavier laughed, settling her more securely in his arms. "Kittens it is. Coming, Catherine." Together they walked toward the barn, the late afternoon sun gilding the scene in tones of gold and amber. James's excited voice could be heard explaining to the barn cat, a dignified tabby named Duchess, that her babies were the finest kittens in all of New Mexico territory. As they approached, Catherine was struck by the perfect simplicity of the moment, her son's exuberance, her daughter's wide-eyed wonder, her husband's steady presence beside her. From the deepest grief had come this unexpected joy. This family forged not through conventional paths, but through kindness, respect, and love that had grown slowly but inextricably between two people who had found each other when they needed it most. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked softly, noting her contemplative expression. Catherine smiled, slipping her hand into his free one as they watched James carefully demonstrate to Ellie how to pet the kittens gently. "I was thinking about that day in the general store," she admitted. "How everything changed because you decided to help a stranger." Xavier's expression softened, his blue eyes warm with memory and present happiness. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. As the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in the rich hues of approaching evening, the family lingered in the barn, sharing in James's delight over the kittens and Ellie's first cautious interactions with the tiny creatures. Outside, Cottonwood Creek Ranch spread in all directions, a testament to what could be built from humble beginnings when founded on mutual respect and genuine affection. Katherine Flanagan, once mocked and isolated in her grief, had found not just security but profound happiness in the arms of the cowboy who had bought her groceries and walked her home. Their story, beginning in an act of simple kindness, had blossomed into a love that sustained them through challenges and joys alike, creating a legacy of compassion and strength that would endure through their children and beyond. And as night fell over the New Mexico territory, stars appearing one by one in the vast canopy of sky above their home, the small family made their way back to the warmth and light of the ranch house, together in all the ways that truly mattered.